Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session entitled eLearning Best Practice based on individual student profiles, similarities and differences between full-time and part-time students and their needs for ideal online learning. Our presenter is Jasmin Séra, and I'll hand over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this session this afternoon. My name is Jasmin. And today I'm presenting on behalf of the City of Vienna Competence Team for the Digitalization of Communication at the FHW University of Applied Sciences for Management and Communication in Vienna. So the ELT conference's theme is shared experiences, different perspectives, and there are different subtopics, amongst them inclusive practices. So the city, the competence team, decided to, this competence team has been working on topics around the digitalization of communication since 2019. And when the COVID pandemic started, the competence team decided to focus on COVID-19 and its effect on students' experiences. So obviously there are different student profiles, and we decided to look at full-time and part-time students. And we wanted to know how these two groups have dealt with the pandemic. So under the subtopic of inclusive practices, the title of our study is eLearning Best Practice based on individual student profiles. Similarities and differences between full-time and part-time students and their needs for ideal online learning. So we also thought about how to define full-time and part-time students. And it's interesting because at our university, we differentiate between these two groups, but there is no real definition. So we decided to focus on at least part-time students and to look into literature and how part-time students are defined there. It was interesting to see that there are no universally accepted definitions of what constitutes part-time study, at least in the UK. And also we didn't find any for Austria. What we know is that part-time students, they differ in age, also in life circumstances, in their personal values, and also in their motivations for studying. We do know that adult learning has the potential to bring enormous benefits in terms of self-fulfillment, health, family functioning, civic participation, and also social attitudes. We are also aware that part-time studying brings structural constraints, such as also providing for living, childcare, and that part-time students need flexible study opportunities. It might be that during the part-time studies, there are no economic benefits to see, but there is evidence that for a better, longer perspective, there are benefits for part-time students. So to come back to our study, we actually conducted two different studies. The first one was conducted at the beginning of the COVID pandemic in March 2020, and the second one was conducted in March 2021, so 1 year after, as a follow-up study. The methodology used was an online survey, and a total number of 561 students participated in this study. These students actually study very different programs, and there were students represented from all 10 bachelor programs and 8 master programs, which are all related to management and communication at this university. So as I mentioned before, we were looking at different student profiles, and to look at the numbers, 52.5% were defined as full-time students and 47.5% were defined as part-time students. Talking a little bit more about the demographics of the participants, I earlier mentioned the percentage of full-time, part-time students. And it was interesting to see that the average age of full-time students was 21.8 years, while it was 26.4 years for part-time students, so a little bit older. The distribution of gender was quite the same, so it was 69.6% female and 30.3% male participations for full-time students, and 68.8% female and 31.2% male participations for part-time students. So I'm now gonna present you the results of this study. And we started by asking our students about their student profile preferences. We differentiated between synchronous studies and asynchronous studies for distance learning. And the results showed that both full-time and part-time students preferred the synchronous study mode, even though part-time students have a slightly bigger tendency towards asynchronous study modes. We also focused on the study content in our survey. And for example, we asked our students what they think about the clarity of the purpose of the digital teaching and learning materials. So roughly 50% of both full-time and part-time students have positive feelings about the clarity of the purpose, whereas part-time students slightly stronger disagree at all to those. The distance learning activities are related to tasks, clear tasks and goals. This question was also asked to the students, and there was generally positive attitude amongst full-time and part-time students. But also we could see that part-time students were more likely to rather disagree or disagree at all. We also asked students about the provided material and if it was sufficient to be able to process the tasks. There was a very positive attitude amongst full-time and part-time students here, but again, part-time students were more likely to rather disagree and disagree at all to full-time students. We asked students about teaching content, if it was clear and understandable. And in general, there was a very clear and positive attitude here, and no extremes could be found. When we asked students about distance learning offers and if they are carefully and competently created, there was a strong rather agree from both full-time and part-time students, and it was also striking to see that part-time students partially agree or disagree at all a little bit more. We ask students if the tasks that are to be processed through distance learning are well suited for distance learning. And here the totally agree was not striking, but the rather agree was dominant. Also, there was a tendency to partially agree, rather disagree, and disagree at all from part-time students. When we asked students about the learning material and if it was updated regularly and if it was up to date, the total agreement and rather agreement between full-time and part-time students was between 65 and 70%. And it was interesting to see that part-time students are more likely to only partially agree or disagree at all. We also asked the students about how they feel, also looking after students. So when we asked the students how well they felt looked after during the distance learning, the numbers seemed quite balanced. But we could see that part-time students only partially agree more often than full-time students. And interestingly, more full-time students say that they rather disagree than part-time students. We also asked the students about the workload and whether lecturers correctly estimate the workload for independent assignments. And we could see that part-time students rather disagree or disagree at all than full-time students. And in general, the tendency was not only positive here. When we ask students whether the quality of distance learning offers varies from one course to another, the agreement shows that the quality of the courses are not balanced and they very much vary from one course to another. We also asked a question if using 100% distance learning makes students deal with the content more intensively. And full-time students said that they clearly disagree, that dealing with the content makes them, via distance learning, makes them study more intensively. And we could see that part-time students had a smaller tendency here. When we asked students whether 100% distance learning makes them learn more independently, they said that part-time students more often totally or rather agree than full-time students, and full-time students more often disagree than part-time students. We also asked a question about the learning progress and if 100% distance learning helps them to check also their learning progress. And the results were not so positive here, I would say even rather negative, and especially part-time students rather disagreed to this question. So talking about the general distance learning agreement, we could see that between 45 and 60% showed a very positive attitude here, but part-time students show a stronger rather disagreement or disagreement at all. We also talked about the quality of the content and if the information provided in this course helped students to stay attentive. And here we could see a rather positive attitude in general. We also talked about the distance learning motivation. And we asked students if they were able to stay motivated even when the editor wasn't online all the time. And the responses were quite positive, but we had a stronger disagreement at all from part-time students. When we asked the students if online tools helped to stay alert, there was a general positive answer, but also the rather agreement and partial agreement was stronger from part-time students. Another very important topic within our survey was distance learning attention. And we asked the students whether their attendance has become more or less or has stayed the same during 100% distance learning. So the general tendency was to have the same amount of attendance, but part-time students were more likely to attend classes more often, as well as more likely to attend them less often. So we could see that the changes were bigger for part-time students than for full-time students. We also asked our students if they found it challenging to manage their presence themselves during 100% full-time, 100% distance learning. And both groups said they did not agree to that it is challenging. Another question was if they found it advantageous to be able to monitor their learning progress themselves. And there was a clear tendency, especially from the part-time students, to see advantages of distance learning for individual monitoring. A further question was, by suspending the compulsory attendance, I can better reconcile my studies and work. And here we found very clear positive tendencies from part-time students and more balanced answers from full-time students. We asked the same question. So by suspending the compulsory attendance, I can better balance my studies and private life. And again, we could see a very positive tendency from part-time students and a more balanced answer pattern from full-time students. All right, so after presenting you the results of our study, we came to some conclusions. So first of all, we could see that part-time students have a slightly bigger tendency to prefer asynchronous study modes than full-time students, which makes sense because they have other things to do. In general, there is a need to be more precise and also careful when preparing and explaining study goals and tasks, and also providing learning material. And this, again, is especially important for part-time students. Also, we found that it is really important to update learning material because students notice. And yes, so also there is a great need to look after students in a more not so academic way, but just to check in really, and in particular for part-time students. Also, we found that it's really important to adapt the workload because there are great differences between different courses, and there is a great need to be consistent. And again, this is very important for part-time students. Finally, we made the conclusion that self-management of time has been found to be very positive. And it shows certain benefits also for part-time students. At the end of this presentation, I also wanted to share with you some recommendations that we have. So for the future, it is really important to work out flexible forms of studying. And I know that's very difficult also for logistics, but it can be very helpful for part-time students. Again, to be very precise and also clear when it comes to study content and study goals. Also, it is highly recommended to work out the exact measurement and also rules of workload for lecturers. And finally, also to understand the results of the study and try to implement them into new study programs. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, comments, or queries, please contact me under this email address. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jasmin, for a really interesting presentation with so much detail and quite a lot of interesting results that sort of drew out. So we've got time for some questions, and there's one from Luke. I think the question will go up on the screen, so you can read it yourself if you'd like to, or I can read it out.
Yes, it's a bit small, but is
okay.
The distance course the same course as the traditional course? If so, was it adapted from traditional to distance learning? It may explain the workload expectations. Yes, so I think we have to differentiate between different courses because the first year when the survey was done, obviously most of the courses were just transitioned to being online. So there was not a lot of time to really adapt the study content to distance learning content. The second year, it was adapted to distance learning. So yes, sorry, I don't see the question anymore, but yes, okay, so let's continue with the next question probably, huh? Okay, are there any factors that might help explain why part-time learners were less positive about the quality of the materials, ability to complete tasks, currency of material, or any hypotheses? Thank you. Yes, so what we could see from the results is that because part-time learners were already dealing with many difficulties in their work life, which also was transitioned to online very often. They might not have had the same capacities to keep up with the demands of the lecturers. So it would have been necessary to provide more time really to give extra time for tutorials or just the time to ask questions for part-time learners, and also to give them the feeling that they are being heard. Thank you for the question. Is there a correlation between... Yes?
No, I was just going to say a question from Ricardo.
Okay. Is there a correlation between instructions, preparation, self-management, improvement in students? Did you test this? No, we have not. That's a very interesting point. Thank you very much for the comment. We will take this to the next study. Okay.
And there's another question there, sorry.
Okay, yes, I can see it. Is the main finding the responses of both groups were very similar, but studying online is still more challenging to part-time students? Actually, I was thinking about this for a long time, and I think it is similar in many ways, but the extremes are the interesting parts that make us see that it is actually helpful for part-time students to do distance learning. And it might be very, like the differences might not be very big, but I think they're very relevant. And we need to focus on these also to improve also study life for part-time students. Thank you for the question. Okay, do part-time students, yes? Do part-time students get less involved in asynchronous group discussions? So from the concept of how we understand asynchronous group, asynchronous study modes, there is actually no interaction between students and lecturers, because very often in asynchronous, our lecturers give tasks to the students, and then within a certain time frame, students need to answer those. So the discussions, there are no discussions in that sense, because it's not happening at the same time, if this is what you mean.
There's one last question. I think that we've got time for one more. Thank you.
Okay. From my experiences, they're not less involved, but have less opportunity to become involved. Here, my idealistic self will scream and say, "Oh no, we have to try to involve them as much." I think that's very important. It's tricky, but it's really important. That should definitely be a focus of ourselves in distance learning.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we've got time for. Thanks again, Jasmin, for a fascinating presentation and for addressing all of these questions. And
thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.